I want to start with a mathematical theory called set theory in order just to help us enter into this dialogue. Now, any mathematicians here in the room? Shoot. Set theory is a mathematical idea. It's not one that has been set in the church, but anthropologists, Christian anthropologists, have pulled it in as a way of helping us to have certain discussions. But set theory, it can be described in a couple of different ways. It kind of helps you determine a couple of things. It's a concept in mathematics that allows us to understand of what numbers belong to a group or to a set. And within set theory, there's a group called bounded sets. And there's a group called centered sets. And so, bounded sets. Now, this is probably not, mathematicians don't use this simplistic of a way of determining which numbers fit, but this is the easiest way that I can make sense of it. In a bounded set, there are certain things that describe what is in and what is out. There's clear markers of definitions for membership within this. So, like prime numbers. Bounded sets are usually defined by a circle. There's a boundary, and that what's in is in, and those on the outside are out. So if prime numbers are the bounded set, we would say 1, 3, 7, 11, 13, 17, 22, 23... 29, 31, and so on. I can't go much further. 37, 41. So here's confession. I love prime numbers. That's as far as my mathematical abilities go. I love prime numbers. I'm 41 right now. And I love that because and anyone who has a prime number birthday, I'm like, what's a prime number? And they're like, so what? I'm like, oh, you're indivisible. And I make it spiritual. You're indivisible to Jesus. I hope it's the case. So that's why I love prime numbers. Okay, so you get this. There's a bounded set. The prime numbers would be in. Anything that's not prime is out. Set theory can be used for a number of other things. So we could use the example that what's inside this boundary is in, what is out is out. And how about apples? For an example, we could say, here's an apple, and there'd be certain characteristics that would define what was in. So if an apple was the category that you're trying to set in there, you'd be asking certain things that define something as an apple. And so it would be like it has skin, it has seeds, all sorts of things, but it would determine it is an apple. And then everything that was an apple would be outside. But the one thing that bounded sets don't determine, it's static, so it doesn't qualify the quality of the apple. So a rotten apple is still within the bounded set. So it's static. It's a boundary. The Christian church has largely organized itself as a bounded set, that those who share the same beliefs and values are in the set, and those who disagree are outside of the set. But in set theory, this is not the only. And most of us would be able to, we would say, okay, yeah, we get that. Somebody's in, somebody's out, based upon certain beliefs or values. And this is not always wrong. Sometimes this is even helpful. But if this is the lens which you view the world through and you make your decisions through, it can be incredibly harmful. In set theory, the other set, besides a bounded set, is called centered set. And a centered set is usually based upon a fixed point or a fixed object, and whether you determine whether you're a part of that category is in relation to you moving and orienting yourself towards that point. So those who would be in that category would be moving closer to this fixed point, and those moving away from this fixed point would not be a part of that category, not part of that set, not a part of the membership within these kinds of describing and organizing itself. So an example would be bald-headed people, or bald head. And so we would say, and you say, how's that different? Well, let's pick the epitome of this, and we'll say it's Mr. Clean. Mr. Clean is our center set. And so if you're born into this world as a baby, you're born bald-headed. And so you are then oriented much more closely within this grouping towards Mr. Clean. But as you begin to grow and develop and hair begins to grow, you found yourself on the outside of this grouping and no longer a part of it. But maybe you turn 20 years old and begin to comb your hair and you see more and more hair coming off on the comb. You find yourself being moved into this category more quickly, more clearly, and you're getting closer and closer to this fixed point. Does that make sense of how a centered set would be in that way? A centered set is determined by a focus on the center. They're dynamic. They're in motion. They're not static. With centered sets, the key question is this: whether I am oriented and moving toward the center or moving away from the center. I'm defined on where I am and where I'm moving in relation to the center. So as a centered set Christian, if we pull this in, there was an anthropologist who was a Christian who was pulling this in. The Vineyard Church has used this language a lot regarding determining who's in and who's out for the sake of controversial issues at different times. But in a centered set membership, it would be dependent upon moving toward the central point of Jesus. That's what we're moving towards. He is our fixed point. And in sort of being part of this set is if you're moving, you're orienting yourself and Jesus, and along the way, there's points of people who might describe themselves of being further away from that center, but their orientation and their movement is toward Jesus. And they're looking more like him. And there'd be others who say, no, I'm not moving. Jesus is not my center. He is not my fixed point. I'm moving whatever direction I want to move in. I set my own terms in my own direction. All of us are at different spots within this. We say what matters is Jesus is our fixed point, and we're being moved closer to him. And on this journey, there's all sorts of things that would come into play that would speak into the reality of us moving closer to Jesus, that we'd be conformed more and more into his likeness. When Jesus, when he was investing in his disciples, that was his aim. They were coming with him to be shaped by him along the way. And all of them were at different places and had all sorts of issues. But what mattered was Jesus as being the point of reference and their movement and their focus towards him, rather than just around a shared set of beliefs or values. I was reading in a blog, and they said in Australia that there's two main ways for keeping cattle on a ranch. And they said this: you can build a fence around the perimeter, or you can put a well in the middle. And Jesus is a well, right? Not a fence. David Schmesler, I said his name wrong. He was a pastor within the Vineyard Church, and he writes a blog that I found really interesting and helpful. It's called Deep Ocean Blog, a Blue Ocean Blog, something like that. Google it with this poorly pronounced last name and poorly remembered title, and you'll find it. No. But I found this to be helpful. Anyone who is doing their best, or who is navigating their way, because best is maybe not in the right way, anyone who's navigating their way towards Jesus and to help others to do the same is a friend. When Jesus was questioned by his disciples about different people who were casting out demons in his name but weren't really a part of his little discipling troop, and they went to Jesus and said, Jesus, should we tell them to stop? And he said, no, those who are not against me are for me. So those who are navigating their way towards Jesus and helping others to do the same is a friend. And opinions about controversial things are not the issue. Moving towards Jesus and helping as many others as possible to do the same is the issue. That's our posture. That's what we want to make the issue here. You orienting your life to Jesus by his grace, his pursuit, his invitation, his Holy Spirit, and inviting others to orient your life with you. And you might be a few steps ahead of them or a few steps behind them. That is the issue. But in this, we need some guiding principles, right? We need a way to engage this because in order to posture ourselves in this way, there is tension. There is tension around controversial issues where people don't have agreement, where they disagree on what the scriptures are saying and how to interpret them. And the guiding principles that we need to learn how the need for the sense to have a comfort while living in tension. And many of us don't know how to do that. The question regarding LGBT and the questions regarding LGBT are less than ultimate questions. Believing that salvation is by way of trusting in Jesus alone. Do you understand that? The ultimate questions that we're kind of saying is about trusting in Jesus alone. That's the ultimate question. And the questions regarding and revolving around things with the LGBT community are not ultimate questions. And that one could be wrong on this theological and pastoral question and yet still be in good standing with Jesus. Do you know that? That you could be wrong on theological issues and still be in good standing with Jesus as you're orienting your life towards Him, as He is speaking into certain things in your life and you are agreeing and moving yourself in relationship that. And not everything has been addressed in your life. We can be in good standing with Jesus and we could be wrong on theological and pastoral questions. And we, a guiding principle, we need to be peaceable. We need to have, irenic is the term that I was reading that was being encouraged as a culture. It means you're conducive to peace. We need to be conducive to peace. We need to have a quality about us that's conducive for peace. Meaning this, that you could believe that thoughtful Christians of goodwill could legitimately disagree on this. And that's where for many the tension arises on however you slice your disagreements. Thoughtful Christians of goodwill could disagree on this. And to be peaceable is the quality that we long for. I think this way of viewing things is helpful for us and helpful for our community, what we're caring about orienting ourselves towards Jesus. Now, as the questions arise about leadership in our community and how we determine that, and we say this, that we've got a grid. We try to measure leadership in our community based upon someone's character and their competencies. And at different leadership levels demand different levels of character and competency. And we're doing our best to honestly answer that in this community. That's how we address leadership. But I think I need to turn to this because this is the way that we think is the most crucial way of answering some questions about what we're making the key issue for us is about our orientation to Jesus and moving towards Him. Now, that doesn't end this discussion or silence anything, but I think we need to talk a little bit more about bounded sets. Because many of us have bounded sets, and bounded sets are not inappropriate. They're not wrong. The Jewish people had bounded sets of thinking when God gave them Torah, His instruction, and He said to those people, obey the Sabbath. They had to determine of saying, well, what does that actually look like to obey the Sabbath? What determines if we're actually being a people who love this instruction to rest with our Father and do it? And they created sort of bounded. So they went to rabbis and they said, Rabbi, what does this mean for us? And different rabbis disagreed. And they had different ideas of what it meant to actually obey out of love for God, this idea of a bounded set. And sometimes you saw Jesus getting challenged for the way that He would interpreting obeying the Sabbath, because He was someone who obeyed the Sabbath. But yet He had a different determination of what that meant and God's intention for the Sabbath for the good of people. And so I want to turn to this bounded set that many of us have. And for us, there's a bounded set that revolves around the question around sexuality. We say, this question of God and sexuality is this idea that says, hey, what was God's intentions for sexuality? And what are the things that we would say that the Father speaks into and says, hey, this is my intent for humanity and the way that it would participate in sexualness with other people in encounters, right? And so here's what I would say, and many people would say a lot of different things to this bounded set thinking, right? And for me as a Christian, and as a church, as Christians, we say we value the Word of God. We know it's the inspired and spirited text. And it gives us insight into different things. And there's text in there that talk about sexuality. And so we come up with different boundaries. One of them would be like this. This would be a boundary. This would be a bounded set thinking that I would affirm to. That you would, if you put me within it, this is where I would land. It would be answering this question about appropriate sexuality. That God's intent for sexuality was between a man and a woman in an oath-bind covenant for life. And that anything outside of that boundary misses the mark. Right? That's how bounded sets work. That here's the boundary, and those in it are in, and those out of it are out. Let me just close. Let me pause here real quickly. There are goodwill people who also love the scriptures and have said, no, they have a boundary as well. It's just different. No one in here comes in here and says there's no appropriate, that all bets are off and sexuality can be expressed in any way it wants.